Welcome to our webinar, Materials Matter. Industry experts discuss advancements in orthopedics. This webinar's esteemed panel will help you understand the trends, challenges, and changing regulations when it comes to materials so that you're better positioned to identify gaps from a materials perspective and to explore opportunities paramount to your device's evolution. Carpenter Technology is the sponsor of our webinar. Carpenter Technology offers a diverse alloy portfolio of titanium, cobalt, and steel-based material solutions. The company's additive manufacturing business unit provides end-to-end contract manufacturing solutions to help medical device companies de-risk innovation and accelerate development. Thank you to Carpenter for sponsoring our webinar and sharing their expertise during this panel. As I mentioned, we have a well-respected group of speakers today. Our moderator is Brent Marini, Medical Strategic Business Developer at Carpenter Technology. In his role, Brent works towards elevating Carpenter as the leading orthopedic material supplier with a focus on new material solutions to support medical market trends. Joining him are four panelists. Dr. Gaurav Lalwani is Medical Applications Development Engineer at Carpenter Technology. He manages the technology portfolio and new product development strategy for the medical business unit. He is currently engaged in the development of novel RUT and additive solutions for the medical device industry. Dr. Gordon Hunter is Principal Manager of Materials Science at Smith & Nephew. Dr. Hunter manages standardization of materials and manufacturing processes used for making orthopedic devices. He also is involved with commercial implementation of new materials and processes and led the development of the company's oxinium material. Chuck Hansford is Director, Advanced Development, Center of Excellence at Tecomet. Chuck oversees all additive manufacturing R&D and production at multiple Tecomet sites. He joined Tecomet in 2017 with 35 years of product development experience and 26 years of additive manufacturing experience. And Dale Temko is an industry consultant with extensive experience on the OEM and contract manufacturing side of orthopedics. He specializes in product development, operations, quality, and supply chain. Dale spent 15 years at Medtronic Spinal and Biologics. Brent, I'd like to hand it over to you to begin the discussion.
All right. Thank you, Carolyn, and thanks to the team at Ortho World for organizing and promoting this event. Welcome, audience, and thanks for joining us today. As mentioned, we will be exploring some of the relevant orthopedic trends and topics through the lens of their impact on materials. We will primarily be focused on three areas of discussion. First, exploring the continued dialogue surrounding the use of cobalt materials for orthopedic applications. Second, the rise and growth of minimally invasive and robotic-assisted surgical techniques. And third, but certainly not least, the emergence and expansion of additive manufacturing for orthopedics. Our panel will discuss these topics in the following 40 to 45 minutes, leaving 10 to 15 minutes to answer your questions. Okay. Let's dive right in with the first topic, the presence of cobalt. The use of cobalt alloys, primarily CCM, ASTM F1537, and F799 in orthopedics, has a long-standing presence in various applications. There has been a lot of dialogue that has occurred concerning its potential negative impact on patients. This has been heightened by the new EU MDR regulation going into effect later in May of this year. This regulation requires medical devices that contain more than 0.1% cobalt to indicate on the device or on a warning label the presence of cobalt as a potential CMR. As an important element, especially for wear applications, has the recent focus on cobalt and impending regulation changed the landscape relative to materials? I'll start it off with Gaurav.
Thank you, Brent. First of all, I would like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the attendees that we have on the panel today. And I would like to thank all the panelists for taking their precious time out and being a part of this webinar. Talking about ASTM 1537 and cobalt chrome moly and the EU MDR changes, let's start with a broader perspective of the alloy system, right? Uh, so the alloy 1537 CCM has more than 4 decades of clinical use history that's backing the safety and efficacy of this alloy for implantable materials, right? One of the first medical implantable use was 4 decades ago for a cardiac valve, right? And since then, it has been widely used in implants with articulating surfaces like hips and knees and extremities because of high wear resistance of the alloy. Now, in 2010 was the first recall of a metal on metal based hip implant, uh, and there was a lot of information on clinical use and awareness of the failure of the implant that was highly publicized. Now, the real issue here with these metal on metal hips is actually not the material, but the design, the medical device design itself, right? Uh, as the ball and the metal socket, they rub against each other, they release metal ions that cause an inflammatory response. And that leads to, a variety of side effects, as metal losses, inflammation. It leads to implant losing over time, right? In 2011, the FDA actually issued more guidance and statements uh, around the safe procedures that the orthopedic surgeon should follow in terms of implantation and monitoring of these implants once implanted, right? So there's an allergy test that's being conducted. They monitor soft tissue degradation using MRI. So there's a lot of awareness around these metal on metal systems. The use has decreased, and in these systems that are already out there in patients are heavily monitored. Now, from materials perspective, right, CCM is still regarded as a biocompatible alloy, uh, and it's still being used as an implantable material, right? Now, there are other compelling material systems that I'm sure Gordon will get into that that are options as alternatives for CCM. Uh, but it was one of the first material systems for orthopedic applications for articulating components, and I don't see that going away anytime soon. Now, as far as the European Union regulations are concerned, and up classification of cobalt, uh, several of our customers, they've indicated that they don't really see that as a major issue because uh, almost every product that you see in the operating theater has some sort of a warning label associated with it, and guidelines for safe use. Uh, Now, the other point that I do want to make is how does that affect the use of CCM going forward and the perception in the community, right? Uh, so the material is safe. Uh, it's a device design, and the way you use the material that's an issue. Uh, and now you see several OEMs taking the metal on metal implant designs off the market. The focus is more on metal on polyethylene type of designs that are more safer. So CCM is still one of the gold standards, and it's probably not going to go away anytime soon. Now, as a consequence of EU MDR, there's one more thing that I do want to point out, is the fact that apart from cobalt, chromium, and molybdenum, there are other stainless alloys that contain cobalt as a trace residual element, right? Uh, and the regulation essentially calls an upper limit of 0.1 weight%. Any material that contains more than 0.1 weight% has essentially, will have to be labeled. Uh, Now, if you look at commonly used stainlesses in medical device industry, like 17.4 and 316, they, by the virtue of their melt practice and scrap streams, they do contain more than 0.1% cobalt as a trace element. Uh, Now, what we have done at Carpenter is essentially we've standardized our raw material procurement processes, we've standardized our melting techniques, our cleanliness techniques, and we now can actually make all of the commonly used stainless grades that are already approved for medical device use at less than 0.1% cobalt. So we've instituted that practice throughout to essentially meet this need of the medical device industry from a stainless perspective. And then, I'll probably pass it on to Gordon or Chuck and get more perspective on this.
So Garv, there's interesting approaches to how people are interpreting this labeling requirement of 0.1%. And I've heard both, and maybe the other panelists want to chime in on this too, saying that if I'm less than 0.1, I don't need to do anything. And in our industry, a lot of our instruments, like stainless steel instruments, do not get to the customer with labeling information, right? They're going out in some surgical set. So there's kind of an issue there. It says, well, wait, EU MDR says you need to put it on the label. You need to communicate it to your user that this has, a CMR in it, whatever. And so there's kind of a gap there. And then the other gap is it says, well, wait a second. If I have more than that, I don't need to just stop and say, oh, I met the requirement by putting it on the label. You also have to look at is it still safe? And even if it's less than 0.1, you still have to say, is it still safe? And this is where, again, different people are digging their heels in a little bit different, and different companies I've worked with that have looked at it differently. Even to the extent that says, oh, to prove that it's safe, you need to have a long clinical tracing of these materials and these products and patients. And in the words of Jordan Peterson, I'd say, good luck with that. That we're going to do clinical follow-up on surgical instruments. So, it's kind of what happens with a bunch of government officials in Brussels pulling strings.
Yeah, I know there's a lot to unpack on the implant and the instrument side. I know, Gordon, I think you sit on some of the industry standards committees as well. And there's been some changes in the standards such as ASTM F899 relative to compliance with reporting. Maybe try to unpack the implants and the instrument side and the impact of this regulation relative to cobalt.
Well, yeah, I sit on some of the ASTM committees and I collaborate with some of the committee members for ISO. What we've been looking at is this issue of the steels that have some residual level of cobalt. And in the past, we haven't controlled that intentionally. So the idea is to put it into the standard that there shall be no more than 0.1 weight% cobalt in these alloys. The suppliers are going to have to control their systems and analyze their product in a way to make sure that they can meet that requirement. But if we have that requirement, then a lot of our issues involving labeling go away. We won't have to label those because the device directive is very clear that the labeling only is required if it goes over 0.1 weight%. So that becomes simpler. The biocompatibility testing doesn't really change as far as we're concerned. We have to prove everything we make is biocompatible at some level in accordance with ASTM and ISO standards. There will be an extra burden in Europe, obviously, if you have a cobalt containing alloy to show that it's safe, but I don't think the burden for that is really going to increase just because of this labeling issue. So it's the real wild card is going to be what happens when those labels start appearing, because they haven't started appearing yet. And if most surgeons and hospitals and healthcare providers understand that cobalt, chrome, moly, and stainless steels and so on have been used in orthopedics for many, many decades, safely and effectively, the labeling probably won't have much impact. But if there is a concern generated because of the labeling, and people start avoiding these products, then there could be a real push toward replacing them or controlling their limits. In the case of the stainless steel, controlling limits. In the case of cobalt chrome moly, replacing them with other materials. It's hard to predict right now how that's going to work out in Europe. We still aren't required to have those labels, and it's going to be difficult to predict exactly what's going to happen. We have seen a movement within the industry away from cobalt chrome in modular junctions because of the interaction with titanium alloy in these modular junctions, for instance, with modular heads on titanium stems. There's a mechanically assisted crevice corrosion issue there that's driven mechanically, electrically, and galvanically between those materials, and it does show a tendency toward release of the cobalt chrome ions from the alloy into the system. And some of these patients react in an unpredictable way, and sometimes in a severe way, apparently severe way. And so there's been a move away from cobalt chrome moly modular heads in many of these in many practices, and ceramic heads have been available commercially for a long time. We have an alternative at Smith and Nephew with our oxinium zirconium based systems that do not contain intentional additions of cobalt chrome moly and so on. And these systems appear to reduce both the mechanically assisted crevice corrosion, and of course, without the cobalt chrome, we don't have that release of those cobalt and chrome ions at high levels. So we've seen a movement in the market away from cobalt chrome moly heads in several of our customers.
So I think, is there additional room? Obviously, you've presented some applications in which there's concern. There's been some public discord about the release of cobalt ions. I mean, what's the appetite for material innovation in these types of applications that don't already have a solution? What's that look like for the orthopedic industry? How long will that take? And is there, opportunity there?
Well,
anyone jump in.
How long will it take to develop new alloys? It takes a very long time. It takes over 10 years to develop an alloy, do all the testing required to introduce it into the market, and go through all of the regulatory hurdles required to get these products registered, not only in the United States, but in every country in the world. Every country has their own regulatory requirements, and it is hard to justify the introduction of a new material when the materials we have, including cobalt chrome moly, when they work so well already. So the barrier to entry is very high. The cost of entry is very high. And so unless there is a really strong driving force toward alternative alloys and alternative materials, it's not going to happen in the current regulatory environment, except in very extraordinary circumstances. The oxinium product that we invented and introduced into the market took 11 years from the point of introduction to the point where we were ready to start using it commercially. And I won't even begin to guess at how many dollars were associated with that. Many man hours, obviously, involved in that. And we just don't see the driving force for yet another innovation along those lines, with the coming introduction of more and more biological solutions that's where the real driving force and growth in the market's going to come in the next 10 to 20 years. So there's limited ability to recover all of those development costs that are necessary to introduce new materials. We've been involved in particular recently in developing a new dual mobility hip system, acetabular component for total hip replacements. These are used to increase safety of the device so that you reduce the potential for joint dislocations and so on. Those devices typically have had a cobalt chrome moly liner in them against a titanium shell in a large modular junction. Those have shown a tendency towards corrosion and ion release from those areas. We really recently introduced our OR30 system with an oxinium liner in that system to replace the cobalt chrome to reduce the amount of taper corrosion and release of the undesirable ions. And that system has been well accepted in the market in a very short period of time, particularly considering the restrictions of launching a product during the COVID crisis. So there's clearly a driving force for alternatives. It's not going to completely displace cobalt chrome moly in the market. There's always going to be a need for those, and there are an awful lot of patients that have these devices and are very happy with them. And there are lots of considerations that go into material choice and product applications. So I just don't see that it being completely replaced, but we will continue to see trends in changes in the relative amount of cobalt chrome used relative to these alternative materials.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So I think we'll move on to the MIS robotic surgery discussion. Both MIS and robotic surgical procedures focus on increasing patient and surgeon outcomes via an improved procedure. MarketWatch published a report in December of 2020 that the globally MIS instrument market is expected to exceed 26 billion by 2024 at an average growth rate of 12% per year. And the robotics market is also predicted by Persistence Market Research to grow over 400% by 2029. So clearly, I think these technologies are here to stay. There's a race to launching different platforms to support these types of procedures. So I'll start with Dale. How does that impact material needs and/or manufacturing trends necessary to support these types of procedures?
So, we started doing MIS spine procedures over 20 years ago, and we started seeing it back then that tolerances are getting tight, but with robotics, it's even getting crazier. So why are they so tight? I worked with robotics when I was still in engineering school. So this goes back a long ways, and things have developed quite a bit. But if you think about it, your arm and all these joints, it's no different than some of the robots we have today. It's not just X, Y, and Z in a Cartesian coordinate. You got pitch and yaw and all these different things. And each one of these joints has both mechanical and electrical software type errors to it. So if I'm trying to position a drill guide or something or place a pedicle screw, at the end of this instrument, and it's not straight, it's not positioned correctly. And yeah, we have ways, software ways. Years ago we used to take a lot of the backlash and stuff out because using a method called dither, where a robot actually can't go to certain coordinates in space. It goes and tries to hit it, but it's either too far or too back. So it's constantly moving and little tiny micro movements trying to hit where it thinks it's supposed to be. So you do things like that, but you still have all these, just like an old guy like me, I have all these problems with my joints and I get a little slop in them and you have a problem with positioning. So if you pictured that pencil and I'm trying to rotate it like that, and that thing's not perfectly straight, I mean, the software guys and the robot guys used up all the tolerance. So now they're basically saying, oh, you guys that machine these parts, just make them perfect. So we're seeing these crazy tight tolerances on TIR, on true position, on straightness and things like that. And that's part of the reason. The other thing we're seeing is things getting smaller and smaller. Okay. And I will go back and say, I think there are options for newer materials for instruments, especially when we start talking about reducing things. I'll tell you that, I had a conversation with Brett and his team a while back about some new materials that were in the pipeline. And I see this one, I'm starting getting all giddy. I said, wow, you can hit that UTS and that yield and that elongation. And he says, yeah, but we're probably not going to move forward with that alloy. I said, why not? He says, well, the Sharpies really start falling off. I said, what temperature? He says, maybe around -20 or something like that. And I said, I've been in a lot of cold ORs, but none that have been -20. So I think the industry needs to give people like Carpenter that are willing to look at developing materials, because a lot of the stuff we're using came out of the aerospace industry. They had no customer input from the device people. So our applications and stuff are somewhat different. So we owe it to them to say, this is kind of what we need. I need a material that's incredibly stable. I need to start pushing up the yield strengths. I need to start pushing up the UTS. I need to still maintain some reasonableness of ductility. And so I need some elongation, and we kind of need to tell them that. So all these things are kind of manifesting themselves, when we start looking, like I said, we started seeing it before with some tight tolerances and MIS stuff, but now we're even seeing it more with robotics.
Yeah, thanks, Dale. I know, Chuck, prior to Ticomet, you've got a lot of experience on the instrument side. Is there anything you'd want to add on either the MIS trend or robotics?
I think, Dale was absolutely correct. The product is getting smaller and smaller. Tolerances are getting tighter and tighter. So looking at manufacturing methods to make these parts, your tooling is got to be small, right? And so the materials have to be able to yield to whatever that size tool that you can get in there to use. I know there was at one point, and this is going back probably 5-6 years ago, looking at additive as an application for making these small components. But at the time, you could not yield the tolerances that these materials or the parts needed to be. So I think that, as we move forward, understanding the need, understanding the end result, and if technology can keep up with the need is going to be the biggest issue that I see.
And I agree with Gordon. I mean, we make things that with a few thousands all day and all night, but now we're talking a few tens.
Right.
And now we're talking really critical features. So people want PPKs and CPKs in the 1.33 or even higher. And all of a sudden now your couple of tenths get cut, into a fraction of that. And we might be able to machine it if we start looking at different methods than we've used in the past, but now inspection also becomes a problem.
Yes.
A little outside the topic of materials, but that it leads to the requirements for stability of these materials.
Yeah, and as is, not only the robotic end of it, but also the disposable end of it, right? So when you're looking at those materials and the costs associated with one single patient and throwing it away. So that was the trend of going to plastics, but now your plastics may not be able to hold up to the rigidity necessary to do what has to happen during these procedures. So it's a big dynamic, but the shift is going in that direction. So we as manufacturers have to start looking at outside of what we normally do to manufacture product.
Yeah. I mean, if I can add to it, right? I mean, Dale really did bring up a good point. When you look at the options of material available for the kind of applications that the medical device industry is focused on, all of them pretty much, or a majority of them, come from the aerospace industry, right? CCM was initially developed as an alloy for landing gear applications, right? So I think, Bren, as you pointed out, right, the the trend of robotics and minimal invasive surgeries is here to stay. It's growing, and with that, there's going to be more and more focus on tight tolerance instrumentation applications. Parts that have to be really machined at very fine features and fine dimensions. From a materials perspective, the way we see that as playing out is that, in addition to elevated properties that Dale mentioned, right, with respect to high yields and high ductilities to be able to achieve these fine features, there's also a big shift in manufacturing methods, right? I mean, you see all the advancements in CNC milling and machining now that's coming out with these next generation systems. And with all the focus on Industry 4.0, with lights out manufacturing, one operator trying to run the entire shop floor, uh, you know, uh, I think it becomes very important for a material supplier as Carpenter to actually understand these trends and try and support them to the best of our ability, right? And we do see the voices in the industry, helping us and guiding us towards these kind of challenges, right? So if I have to give you an example, right, I mean, 17.4 is a widely used alloy in the medical industry, right? I mean, now, several of our customers who are in the robotic systems industry reached out, and they were having difficulties in machining these small surgical tools that they use for these robots out of 17.4 because the material inherently had some residual stress the way it's produced, and that would lead to a lot of movement and warping during machining of these fine features, and they would essentially run 40%, 50% scrap in some cases, right? So how do you come up with a solution to that, right? And so we've been taking a good hard look at the production processes of these materials, right? The way we produce them, the way we treat them, along with the metallurgical knowledge that we have with respect to all of the different alloys that we make across different industries, and trying to learn from all of those areas and understanding how can we apply something here to come up with a solution for this trend that is definitely going to stay and only going to become more prominent as we move forward.
Yeah, I think it's fair here to also mention, we've been kind of implying it in the conversation. A lot of the materials we use are developed in other industries and then applied to medical industry. And the bottom line reason for that is we just don't have the volume. If you think about how much material we use as an industry in a year, it's a fraction of what aerospace uses, or automotive, or construction, or any of the other industries that you can think of. And so when you are trying to develop something new, particularly if it's something small, a small instrument, we may not use more than 10,000 pounds as an industry of that alloy in a year. And trying to support introduction of new technologies around those kind of volumes are very challenging. So I think Gaurav makes a great point here that Carpenter, serving multiple industries, and our other suppliers like Carpenter who serve multiple industries, have a better chance of developing some of these applications because they can access more volume than we can from within the orthopedic industry. And
Everybody
we're
looks
going to continue to see that with the robotics as well, is that we're going to be borrowing from other people to make this happen. I'm sorry, Dale, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to throw out that when I talked about this material with Carpenter, they said, well, maybe we will pull it back into the pipeline because those big guys have a lot of leverage with price, and everybody targets the medical device industry for huge margins. And so there's room there. There's room there. Now, implant materials, you're right. These are huge endeavors. But on the instrument materials, you're talking, this is a slight modification to an existing material that gives you these great, fantastic properties. if people want to engage it, especially the big OEMs, and they're extremely risk averse. They don't want to push the envelope. But the middle tier guys are, and they're developing these things and they're going after it, and that's where we see a lot of growth, of course, in our industry, is from the middle tier guys.
Well, I think we want to give adequate time for additive manufacturing because it's such a hot topic. So we'll go ahead and shift our focus there. I think it's good dialogue. Hopefully we'll have some questions around either the instrumentation or Cobalt that we can maybe dive back into these topics. So yeah, I don't think you can bump into anyone in the ortho space without talking about additive manufacturing. I think there's still room for growth there. And if you look at actually the FDA cleared additive manufacturing devices, more than 90% of them are made from either titanium grade 23, which is the Ti-64 Eli, or grade 5, which is Ti-64. Why do you guys think that is? We'll start with Chuck.
I think that, excuse me, the materials lend themselves perfectly for the medical environment. And I think, I think the material of choice would be the grade 23 because of the low oxygen content. I think a lot of companies that I've dealt with have migrated to grade 5 because of not being able to control the oxygen content through the development process of the additive machine. Oxygen tends to grow in that environment. And again, I think that's the biggest reason for the grade 5. Grade 23 would probably be the material of choice. And I think, from the medical environment, those are materials that have shown the best end result going through the additive process. Now, from an additive manufacturing standpoint, titanium is one of the hardest materials to actually grow in the process because of the residual stress and some of the effects that happen during the welding process. But I will tell you that in the past 20 years, titanium has been the #1 used material in my environment. And it's only because of the quality of the product and the ability to grow and control.
It's what the industry knows, and a lot of the predicates are raw material. And it's kind of like this chicken and egg thing. I lived in South Carolina for a while. I'll tell you this story. I lived in South Carolina, and there they have barbecue, right? And our local barbecue place was only open on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So I asked, why, one of the local engineers in my group, I said, why is Rogers only open Thursday, Friday, and Saturday? And he says, well, that's when we eat barbecue. I said, well, why do you eat barbecue on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday? He looks at me with this dumb look on his face, because that's when they're open. And so why are we using 6.4 Eli and not 6.4 Eli and 6.4? Because that's when they're open. It's like we kind of get stuck in there, and there's untold number of exotic alloys out there, but again, we're kind of risk averse and they're not open.
Well, plus I think, to that extent, the process time to develop parameters around other materials is rarely involved. And if the OEM of the equipment or even the material manufacturers aren't helping you develop that, most companies can't do it on their own. They don't have the expertise and they don't have the time to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, we all know the reasons why titanium is being used, right? As Dave pointed out, that was a great analogy, right? People know what they know. But just so that I can point out for the audience, titanium is a biocompatible alloy. It favors osseointegration very well, right? And we've been using it for a number of years. So there's a lot of familiarity with the alloy system, right? So logically, that ended up being, one of the first alloy systems to be used. And that's what you see out there with, more than 90% of the FDA devices based on titanium. And as Chuck pointed out, right, grade 23 is definitely, one of the material systems that is going to be used as a focus material for medical applications. And that goes into, the suitability of powders being available at their low oxygen levels, being able to accommodate the oxygen pickup that happens during the build, processes. So there's a little bit of flexibility over there. Now that comes at a compromise of strength, versus grade 5, right? So now the question is that, okay, so you have, a lot of experience and maturity in the field with titanium 3D printing. You've been able to print a few applications that have been a success in the industry. Now, how do you take the next step and try and print something that's radical? Do you need elevated properties? Do you have a material or a powder system that can support that, right? So we constantly come across these challenges, when we speak with industry experts like who we have on the panel here. The need for higher properties in titanium powder, right? That's why we have grade 23 plus, where you get 20% improvement in yield and ultimate. At the same time, you get improvement in ductility, right? That doesn't really go hand in hand. Conventional metallurgy says that if your ultimate yield increase, it's probably compromising on ductility. And then we also get a lot of questions around, hey, what's the next generation of additive manufacturing, right? What's new in the material pipeline? Because now people are trying to print, apart from orthopedic implants with cups, cerebellar cups, and you have, your spinal cages, people are exploring, instrumentation, right? Custom instrumentation, surgical guides. There are a lot of groups that are exploring, materials like CCM for printing of cardiovascular valves, nitinol for printing of cardiovascular devices. So at Carpenter, what we are doing is we are trying to provide support to the industry in general with availability of these powders. And at the same time, we are also developing printing parameters and an understanding of how to actually use these material systems effectively, right? Because printing titanium versus printing cobalt chrome versus printing nitinol, these are completely different systems and need completely different expertise. So we although there has been, although titanium has been the majority of the devices, and it's probably going to continue in that same fashion, you see a lot of activity around these alternate material systems that's coming up. And it's critical for us to actually provide support to that, because, who knows what kind of applications might come out of these other materials, right? 10 years ago, when titanium AM was starting out, I mean, who knew that it's going to be so big, right? There were indications, early indications, and the industry has turned out the way it has. So we should understand these trends and try and support, these alternative material systems as they come forward.
Rob, I think
So-
you're absolutely right. I think what you're going to see as trends evolve and the acceptance of additive manufacturing as a production option grows, you're going to see a bigger trend into different material applications, right? But that also is going to require the F42 committee to develop the STM standards around those materials.
Yep.
I think you could have a huge market today in 17.4 stainless steel instrumentation if there were a standard created today to support that, right? We've been doing development of instrumentation for probably the last 5 or 6 years using 17.4 materials that we have found, and I would say the majority of them do not reach H900 hardening condition, right? And that's a need. You can't do instruments without having that capability, right? And I'm not talking about a modified system where you have to create your own heat treat process to reach H900, right? It needs to follow the standard. And I think the other issue with materials in the additive market is that this misunderstanding that even though you may not reach rod or even forge capabilities of the materials, you still reach levels that supersede the need of what the product is today, right? But but yet we're so focused on what we've always done and how we've always done it, we forget to look at how we can improve it moving forward with the new technologies and the new materials.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, if you ask a lot of and I've been on both sides, all corners of this thing. So, but if you ask why are you doing H900, it's like it was on the predicate, and do they need the hardness, and is it a wear surface, and all these things, and people just do it. Well, I need the corrosion resistance. Well, you're talking a few thousand hydrochloric acid or something. The corrosion resistance probably doesn't have that big an impact. And again, it's our environments, we're going to steam sterilize it. But yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities there. I will say one thing though, that when you're talking about materials and having people like Carpenter help develop parameters, we know that on a build plate, the parts in the center are different than the parts in the corners, right? And so we could have potentially different parameters and stuff, but do we have materials that are less sensitive to the current technology we have there? Because when you look at real challenges doing that, you talk about process validation, and you say, well, and I'm going to do design verification, right? And then I have to prove that I made the parts correct, and through process validation, it really becomes a challenge. And then you throw in the whole thing of, well, I can make any part anytime I want on any build plate, right? I can mix them up and throw them on there. And it's like now all of a sudden, and this is touted as a huge benefit of AM, right? Oh, you can make any parts you want anytime you want. You can make patient specific parts or blah, blah, blah. Just throw them on the build plate and push a button and go. All of a sudden, how are you going to validate that? How did you know that those parts in the corners and the parts in the center and how all that was put together actually came out with the properties you wanted? So these are some of the challenges I think that carpenters, can also be looking at, and the industry needs to look at.
Right. And I'd say, we've done a lot of work with Carpenter on some of their titanium materials with building tensile bars and doing validation and testing of that. And it's interesting that, we use the standard methods of validating with creating tensile bars and breaking them and doing whatever. But the thing about additive, it's part geometry dependent.
Yep.
And so it no matter what you put on that build, it can be the same geometry part look, but twice the size, and it's going to react differently and have a different result, right? So I tell people, that I work with today, additive is going to be a game changer in manufacturing 5-10 years down the road. Not that it's not a game changer today, but even growing as the market grows. But you can't turn to page whatever in the machinist handbook to find an answer to what you need to know, like you can from subtractive manufacturing, right? We're developing that. We're creating that history as we go with every build we do and every failure we have, right? And so when I look at the industry, and Dale, I agree 100% with what you were saying, that you can throw anything you want on a build plate, right? And I've heard OEMs of the technology say it's plug and play. And I'm like, what world are you living in? Because I could run the same build 10 times and not have a failure. On the 11th build, I lose half my parts.
Exactly.
Why? Right?
Yeah.
And it's trying to understand that and that dynamic in the market. The other thing is that, yes, as the build plates, they differentiate depending on laminar flow based on the back corners. If you're on the smaller platform machines where the laminar flow is going front to back, you have variation in all four corners, with the back left being the worst, right? But as you develop your business and going forward, you can actually create parts in those areas that will yield the same result as the part that's dead center, but you have to do it through trial and error.
Yeah.
And what people tend to do today is they build a lot of tolerance into the part, or they machine the surfaces of every part so they don't care if it's a variation, right? And is that a win for the technology? In my opinion, it's not, right? My opinion is we need to be able to create a product that when it comes off the machine, I don't have to spend another 50% of the time machining it to meet a tolerance.
Exactly. Right. I mean, talk about over engineering, right? I mean, the medical device industry and the aerospace. I mean, these regulated industries are known for over engineering and over complicating things that that may not be really required or critical. Uh, you know, and that's a great point, Chad. I mean, what you mentioned there, right? I can take the same material, do 10 builds, and be okay on those 10 builds, and do an 11th one, and 50% of my parts might fail, right? Uh, Carpenter being a material supplier, we have a slightly different lens on that, right? I mean, there are a lot of factors that go into that, right? Depending on what your device designs are, what you're printing, where on the plate you're printing. But from a materials perspective, we also need to be more cognizant of the fact that what is the quality of our raw material and the quality of our powder that we are actually using to print with, right? And in addition to that, how many times have we actually used and reused the powder, right? And then if we've used it for n number of times, how confident are we that when we use it for n+1, right, when we use it again, that every particle in that 15 to 45 micron distribution that we have has the same chemistry and is uniform for us to be able to get that success and confidence in the build that we would have received had it been virgin powder, right? And then, as it's frequently pointed out, right? We've done studies where we've seen a very small amount of bad particles, after subsequent builds. Very small amount of bad particles can actually lead to micro cracking and stress cracking in certain areas of the parts that you wouldn't have had your powders been clean and of good quality, right? So really understanding the quality of the powder, the amount of times you're able to reuse that, and understanding the particle on a much more granular basis rather than just taking a 1 milligram sample of analysis from a 25 kg lot, right? So more quantitative analysis is what we think is going to be more critical as the industry goes forward and mature. So a lot of our effort is also understanding that and focusing on coming up with solutions along those lines.
Hey, I just want to be cognizant of time here. We do have a couple questions, but I wanted to give Gordon, I know he's been quiet on the AM side. We've mentioned some OEM perspective from Chuck. So I just wanted to give you a couple minutes if you wanted to jump in on the AM discussion here before we answer a couple of the questions.
Well, I don't really have much to add to what's already been said. TIE 6.4 has been used successfully. There's no reason to change it. One of the big advantages with AM is being able to make complex structures. One of the most common complex structures we have in orthopedics is bone ingrowth surfaces. That is compatible with the TIE 6.4. By the way, we prefer the higher oxygen content for strength, not the low oxygen content. Just throw that out there on the floor. We start with the low oxygen content powder because we are going to pick it up, but we're very happy with standard grade properties in our products. But the combination of AM advantages with the titanium for bone ingrowth, that's why we have focused so much as an industry in that area. It's just the two characteristics coincide very, very well. And I don't see that changing in any time soon. Thinking of trying to make something like a nail or a screw or something out of AM doesn't make any sense. We can make it much cheaper and much easier from bar stock than we can with AM, and there's really not any driving force toward the attributes that AM brings. When we start talking about patient-specific products and so on, the technology needs to develop more. Problem is we run these things lights out overnight to build a product. There's a glitch, nobody knows, so you got to put monitoring systems in to know when you might have a defect in your part. And once it's in there, it can't come back out. So now you get scrap. Um, there's a lot that needs to go into development of the AM systems to make them reliable and predictable on a large volume basis before we're going to be able to push into a lot of these other applications that are currently closed to us. But I think the industry as a whole is making great progress along the lines of introducing AM into some of these specialized products, and that trend will just grow as the technology improves. Control of the powder is really critical. I agree with that too. One of the big advantages of AM is you can reuse the powder, so you're supposed to have a high yield. But as Gaurav just pointed out, there are some complications in that. Using 17.4 pH, great, but the heat treatment is different. The heat treatment response is different with AM than it is with what we are used to with wrought and cast materials. So we got to put a lot of research into that before we put them into high demand applications. So I agree with all of that. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, so on the AM front, I think we might just have time for one question, and this one popped up that I think fits nicely with this discussion. How big is the challenge of non-destructive testing of additive built product to get the confidence that the product has no defect and will compromise the product quality? I think, back in OMTech days, when we were in person, Chuck and Gordon had talked about the fear of a failure in industry. So maybe you guys can tackle that one with the minute we have left.
Minute? It's
Yeah.
that's a big topic, but you're absolutely correct. I mean, how do you gauge if a product that you build is not going to fail, right? Because you're testing it against your results of your tensor bar testing that you validated against, right? One of the aspects that we do is we put tensor bars on every build that we have correlation historical data to go back to compare to say that build met the requirements of that validation. But also throw out, what if you have, let's say, 100 pieces on a build and one fails and you stop that building that part, now you yield 99. Your result is different than when you were yielding 100. And how do you guarantee that there's no variation in mechanical properties of those 99 good parts? Because the timing and the heat loss differential of just losing that one part can impact the mechanical properties. And you can't destructively test every part to say it's good or not, right? So, our philosophy is you scrap that build and you start over, right? Is that a win for the technology? No, because it's costly, right? Who eats that cost? And so that is one of the issues that's very hard, and we're struggling with every day to come up with a way to say that, yeah, you may get the right yield from the mechanical property standpoint, but who's to say that there's not subcore porosity that you can't detect? And even doing video of every layer of every build, is that going to tell you have a perfect part? No. So that's a challenge. That's what we're dealing with today. That's one of the biggest challenges.
And with respect to NDT, I have a long history in welding and part of the businesses too, and you always get challenges. Like, you're going to see stuff. That's why we don't call them defects in welding. We call them discontinuities. So all of a sudden now you're saying, I want to use X-ray or eddy current or ultrasonic or whatever it is, and now you've got to set a limit. And now this drives the PDE and quality people crazy, saying, well, I don't want a defect in my material. Okay. So then you got to say, well, how am I going to do my design verification to test the worst case? And I can't actually create these things when, to test them. So there's a whole lot of issues with NDT and this. But again, I think we've seen a lot of improvements over the last few years with additive, and we're going to head down that road even further. And a lot of these things will get sorted out, I think.
Okay, so we are at time. So the questions that we weren't able to address, we will respond to individually. And I really appreciate all of the panelists today and the audience for joining us for this lively discussion. And I will kick it back over to Carolyn.
Thank you to our panelists for sharing their expertise. I want to thank Carpenter for sponsoring this materials webinar and this timely industry topic. And certainly thank you to those who attended. You can learn more about Carpenter at carpentertechnology.com, and you can access an on-demand version of this webinar as well as other important industry topics at bonezonepub.com. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.